The live stream will start in 2 minutes.
I've got myself back on, Gord. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Perfect. Thank you.
And here we go. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of our Lunch and Learn. This is Gord Cook again. I'm the social media director of Thousand Islands Pride. And today I am pleased to share with you my friend Lori Taylor. She, her. Lori is a former administrator in the Upper Canada District School Board. And just a short personal anecdote, one of my biggest disappointments in my teaching and principaling career was being transferred to TISC just to arrive there just as Lori got transferred somewhere else. I was so looking forward to working with her, but it never happened. And it was so disappointing that I ended up retiring. That's enough about me. I'm going to mute myself, which is some people say I should have done long ago, but here we are with Lori Taylor to talk to us about activism in action. Lori.
Thanks so much, Gord. And I hope you never, ever mute yourself. And I shared to a disappointment that we never had a chance to work together at that time, but I have a funny feeling our lives' journeys may take us on some different forms of work together. So used to happen. I'm going to attempt to share my screen with you. I'm going to attempt to share my screen with you right now. And I won't do that throughout the entire chat today, but I just wanted to share a few visual images with you. And then I'm hoping to use this as an opportunity to not only talk about my own activism, but also to try to encourage everyone who might be interested or thinking about getting involved in becoming activists themselves and not really knowing where to go or where to start. I'm hoping this will provide people with a little bit of an opportunity to join in as well. So that's what I'm hoping to address here today. So I'm going to share with you my screen. I'm hoping you can see my screen now and you can see me as well. I too want to, I don't know if I'm advancing right now. I also wanted to say miigwech and thank you, and for many reasons, but start off my presentation in a good way as well, and recognize on unceded Algonquin territory, and very grateful to be here, and very grateful to have the opportunity to speak to you today. So, I wanted to give thanks as well, particularly to Sam Crosby for her organization and involvement, and to Gord Cook as well for being so actively involved in your communities and for fighting to make the world a better place for all. And also to Island, what a great group of people putting together these series of events. And something you'll probably hear me say quite often is that I think that pride is still very, very important in this day and age. And it's so very, very important in our small and rural communities that we have a place to come together and express ourselves. And I thank the committee for all their work. Now, you might be wondering, who is this woman sitting here in front of you talking to you today? I'll tell you a little bit about myself right now. As my good friend Gord Cook said, my name is Lori Taylor. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a very recently retired administrator from the Upper Canada District School Board. Just retired in June, so retired from that gig anyways, and stay tuned for what I might get up to in the near future. Aside from that, I'm also very passionate about being active in my communities, and particularly for forging a path forward for 2S LGBTQIAP+ youth, two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, asexual, pansexual plus youth, and for the community in general. So that definitely has formed a lot of the history of my activism throughout my life. On the screen, you'll see a photo from Brockville Pride, and that's Sam Crosby in the forefront, taken by my good friend Brianna Polubowski, who's a fantastic photographer. So that's a piece of who I am. I'm also a very avid nature photographer. That's something I like to do in my past. So very lucky to be on. We had 3 little owlets out in our property this year, so that's been a really wonderful sense of pride for me. And part of my activism is learning how to be a better steward of the land all the time. Something else about me that you should know is that I identify as a lesbian, and I also will refer to myself as queer. And it's really interesting. I've done a lot of presentations before, and one of the things I always find myself doing is making sure that I out myself, meaning I share my identity at the start of the presentation or the talk that I'm doing, because I have done some presentations before, and someone came up to me once and said, I really enjoyed your presentation, but I wish you would have outed yourself sooner. Because through the entire presentation, I wasn't entirely focusing on what you were saying. I was just community. And I thought, well, that's a really interesting statement. And I guess I'll talk a little bit later about allyship, but just how preoccupied sometimes we can become with notions of identity and how we identify ourselves. So that's a little bit about me for now, and I'll share some stories a little bit later. It's interesting. When I first started thinking about the topic about activism and action, I was just reflecting and just browsing through some articles on the internet. And there's this book called Out North, an archive of queer activism in Canada. And the cover is this really great, colorful with a whole bunch of buttons associated with, different movements, within queer history in Canada. And that kind of reminded me that I'm a passionate collector of buttons myself. And I went back through and got out this button box and, some of the things that I've collected over the years. And then the one hand, it made me feel a little bit old. And you can see some of the things that are on the screen. And then on the other hand, one of the things that when I started to look back on some of the things that I've been involved in, was this, really powerful surge that I've seen over the years of youth really getting involved in activism and becoming part of the change that they want to see. And in organizations, coming to task and getting involved, be it labor groups or businesses or boards getting involved, and I take heart in that. And I remember recently having a conversation with a fantastic person, and we were talking about pride in general, and the need for pride, and a little bit about the whole notion of the commercialization of pride, where we'll often see now sponsorship of pride events, or rainbow Oreo cookies, and Converse will have rainbow Nike or rainbow shoes and various products, like that. And on the one hand, I think we can be a little bit cynical about that, in terms of, I think, it's one thing to have a rainbow on your shoe, but what's your corporate policies in relation to your treatment of your queer employees? And what sort of corporate training are you providing to your employees as they're interacting with the public? But on the other hand, what we were talking about in this conversation with this person was that, this person said to me, as a young person growing up in a rural community, I would have just been over the moon ecstatic to go somewhere and see even a rainbow on a shoe, basically was the gist of the conversation. Because I think, even though we have to watch that line of tokenism and real action, again, I'm going to talk about, for many of us working and living in rural communities, where is our identity reflected, respected, and valued? Where is it shown? How is it shown? And it reminded me too, if you notice on the far, there's a purple lanyard on the far side of the screen. And I'm very humbled and proud to have been involved in some of the early years of planning and organizing Pride in Cornwall, Ontario. And I was a teacher at the time, and I remember a student coming up to me, and he said, very quietly, he said, "I can't ever come to the Pride activities right now." He said, it's not safe for me to be there. But just knowing that there's pride in our community and knowing that it exists, in my life, it's saving my life. And I've never forgotten those words a student said to me. So I think that we can't ever underestimate the value of our activism, the value of visible events such as Pride, and the impact that these events can be having when, we might not even know the value of what they are, and how it's positively impacting someone's life. And we may never hear about it. And I think that's okay too. We don't always have to hear about it, but know how absolutely imperatively important this work is. And I think, people have always said to me, what fuels you to be active or an activist? And I want to say something about the word activism right now, is that sometimes the word activist, and I think it's happening more and more, is used against people who are labeled activists, as somehow that it's a negative connotation. That they see people can view activism just in this very, very, very big way, and broad and expansive. And I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with activism that's big and broad and mobilized. But people, it's so important. I've been involved in activism in that way, clamoring as loud as I possibly could for social change and out on the streets, advocating for change. But advocacy and activism can come in softer and quieter ways, and that's okay too. And for anyone involved in activist work, I don't want any of us to feel that there's by any means that any of that work should have any lack of value. And I think it's really important to think too, how the word activist, can be manipulated and used. One person's activist is another person's humanitarian. And one person's humanitarian is another person's protester. And it's really interesting if we start to pay attention how those words are used, which, leads me to, I guess I've said I've been active and trying to make change for a long, long time. And I think part of it comes from, I have a profound sense of when I see injustice, I want to do something about it. But I also think, some of my experiences as a member of the queer community have not all been positive. And I think back, and this is going to date myself, but I think back to when I was in high school. I didn't even know, and this sounds so ridiculous, I think in today's context, that there was a possibility that I could be a lesbian. I didn't know the term and it existed. And certainly at the time, any representations I saw of myself, and they were so limited, were very negative. And if there was any stories ever being told about, the queer community or lesbians, we before the end of the story. And so certainly I think that never seeing myself represented, and certainly never knowing that, that there were more of us out there, and certainly there were more of us in my high school, that creates, I think, a sense of, within a person, a real questioning of your own worth and the validity of your identity. Because certainly I knew, that I had, an attraction to women, emotionally, spiritually, physically, for a long time, but I never thought that was a possibility that I could be who I was and live my authentic life. And I think, that experience and, others I've had along the way fuels my desire, particularly working with youth and particularly working with schools and school boards and within the education system and community organizations, that how are we continuing to knock down barriers that youth might be facing, or, people in general. And I think, I mentioned that there was a real powerful resurgence of youth, and I think it's always been there, but or challenging notions of gender and identity. And sometimes too, when I present, people always say, what's with this 2S LGBTQIAP plus, those letters are getting more expansive and it's just confusing. And my response to that is, sometimes I think it's just the most wonderful alphabet soup of letters, and how lucky we are within the 2S LGBTQIAP plus community, to be expansive and to come together under all these wonderful identities, and to have folks be able to claim terms and pronouns and identities that best suit themselves. I think that's a wonderful place to be at. But And what I want to say to the adults out there is I think that we have to be cautious and cognizant of the fact that sometimes we're putting youth in places where they're standing out front and saying things that we're reluctant to say, and or that we're scared to say. And I think that, sometimes for youth or for adults even who are, are questioning or coming to terms with their identity, sometimes we've got to make sure that we're standing up and, again, not pushing youth to the forefront to have conversations that we're not willing to have. And I'm hoping that, maybe you've seen on the screen, EGAL Canada is an absolutely fantastic human rights organization that has created their second report on every class in every school. And I think the first one came out around 2011-ish, and I could be wrong. But if we look at the stats, and this is speaking to schools, and it talks about 64% of all participants in this survey reported hearing homophobic comments daily or weekly at school. And you can see some of the other stats there. And then we look at sexual and gender-based harassment, as it occurs within Two-Spirit and Indigenous student populations, and those numbers increase. And we know we look at the intersections of identity for people within the queer community who may be Black or Asian or from a faith group that's not necessarily supporting, and that can be a Christian group as well, and how those intersectionalities of identities mix and often play upon the struggles and the homophobia and the transphobia that people face. And it's important to note that it's not just youth in schools. We see incidences of hate crimes still on the rise. We see, targeting of queer people and members of the non-binary and transgender community targeted in particular. We know that there's a co-relationship between being queer and homelessness and poverty and all those pieces. And so, well, we can look at many of the gains that, we've made in Canada, but know that there's still a lot of work to do. Look at recently what's taking place with conversion therapy in some of our, the votes of some of our own MPs. That certainly tells us that we have a lot of work to do. And so when I think about things, and globally, homosexuality is punishable by death in countries still, that we certainly have a lot of work to do. So this is what fuels me in doing what I do. And I think that, I've been doing this for a long time and I learn every single day. But I think we're at this really interesting place in history too, where, we're watching some of the things that are happening in the US, and, and the target on, trans youth with and the revoking trans youth and, the attack on women's bodies and various things like that. And I don't think anywhere we have the luxury, to use that word, in Canada to sit and think that these pieces aren't happening within our own country now. I find often people will mention that, they feel like there's so much going on in the world right now and it's so overwhelming, and where do I start, or how, like, you've been an activist all your life, you've spoken out, you've tried to make change, and I don't know how to do that. I can't do that. I'm not going to stand out in the street with a sign, or I'm writing a letter to the editors, not my thing. And I think fair enough. But I want to say that we can become activists and make some change in our own ways quite easily. And one of the things that starts with voting. There's a federal election coming up with a lot at stake. Really important. We can read up on the policies of the various parties and the various people, not just in relation to the queer community, but in relation to other issues that you're passionate about. And I think the really good piece that is there is that, and you'll often see throughout my presentations, so I didn't mention about myself, is that, being nature lovers, we're pet lovers too. So we have 4 rescue cats and a black lab. So sometimes you see them used in my presentation, but I think the opportunity is there now for not just members of the queer community to get involved and be active, but allies as well. And I want to say here at this point is that I've often used the word queer community, and I like that because it creates this sense of belonging. But it's really important to know that our community is made up with a diversity of individuals and experiences. And, we share things in common, but we have many differences. And there's a lot of privileges and power dynamics within the community as well. So, under able-bodied Caucasian woman, which certainly I've experienced discrimination for some pieces, of my identity. But there's certainly other pieces of my identity that give me power and privilege as well. And I'm very conscious of that as well. And so, when I also talk about the community is that, I can speak from my own experiences and from my own work, but as a member of the community, I'm also an ally within the community as well, to folks who have had different experiences than I have, or may not have the privileges that I have, and I'm certainly mindful of that as well. And I think that, in the concept of allyship, and it's so important to stand up and be an ally and get involved. If there's something that I've learned over the years is that when you do this work, you're going to take hits, and you're going to have people say homophobic and transphobic things to you. People are going to call into question your very essence or your ability to do your job based on your identity. So it's so important to cultivate a group of friends and a group of people who want to do this work alongside of you. But it's also, and sometimes, sometimes it's okay to take a little bit of a back, have allies, stand up and do some of the work. It's not always up. The queer person should not always have to be the one in the room explaining the importance of pronouns, for example. But it's also really important, I think, when they're doing this work, is that if you're doing any form of activism or allyship, is that not speaking for a community, making sure that we're giving space, if some sort of power or privilege, to give space for a community to speak that may not have that platform. And I think it's so important to be prepared to lean into the discomfort and to be challenged, and to be okay with not always having all the answers, and feeling uncomfortable some of the times. It's all right to be that. And sometimes too, I can tell you that silence sometimes is almost harder to navigate than maybe someone saying the wrong thing. I can't tell you the amount of times I've been in a situation, where I've been with people that I know fairly well, and they're sitting around, and one person's sort of in charge of the conversation and guiding the conversation, and people are talking about how was your weekend, and I did this and this and this with the kids, and it kind of goes around with a group of people, and then the next, and then the person kind of guiding the conversation skips over me and then moves to the next, okay, now we're going to talk about something else. And, so sometimes I'll insert and I'll say, well, hey, you know what? My wife and I had a really great weekend too. We went and visited our nieces and nephews, and I think sometimes, people just how to ask, are, I don't know, or are worried somehow that maybe my life experience will make someone else's, feel uncomfortable in the conversation. And, it's taken me a long time to be able to say this, but it's not my job to make other people identity. I'm more than willing to educate, and I'm more than willing to have conversations. But I think, discomfort is something, if that's what you're feeling, then, people maybe need to challenge why it is that they're feeling that way. And I think too, more and more in becoming an activist, something that I'm becoming better at doing is, I've had many well-intentioned people along the way. I could be attending an event, let's say, and someone might come up and say, and this has happened many a time, watch your back, so-and-so is homophobic. And I'll be like, oh, well, thank you so much for, telling me. And then I think, inevitably I would try to maybe avoid interactions with that person if that is humanly possible. But, more and more I'm getting better at saying, oh, really? Tell me about that. What does that look like? How do you know that? And I think in asking those questions, I want to challenge us and say, if we know that someone is homophobic or transphobic, or we know that an organization or a space is maybe intentionally or unintentionally enacting homophobic or transphobic policies, procedures, and we're not saying anything, and we're not trying to be a part of that change, we're inadvertently contributing down the line to that homophobia and transphobia. And I can't say that enough. I think that's so important that we are standing up each and every single time. And I will caution that, it's important to be involved, but it's also important to constantly be monitoring for safety. And, I mentioned about hate crimes being, on the rise. And, we certainly see social media as being a place where people can hide anonymously behind a keyboard and just throw out, this hateful speech and hateful ideas. But I think, to give an example, if I'm walking through, a hallway in a school, and I hear a student, say something, like, oh, that's so gay. And if I don't stop to interrupt that and educate it, what it does is it gives permission to, everyone else around who may be listening to think, oh, there was an educator walking by. There were, or, if it's in a store or something like that, there were people there and they all walked by and they didn't say anything and they didn't interrupt. And they just gave permission to say that that's okay. And it's not okay. And, people, we hear in this day and age, when you do this work and, oh, you're just stuck up on political correctness. And it's, what, political correctness is just an excuse not to get involved. It's not about political correctness. It's about humanity and ensuring that, people are not telling a joke at the expense of someone else. There's so many more ways to be funny, and there's lots more funny things out there. And I think that, activism begins with those interruptions that have to happen all the time. And so, I think that there's lots of entry points, and I talked about some there for activists to get involved, or people who want to make a change to get involved. And You know, I think that something that I've thought a lot about is I think that folks who are, you know, 2S LGBTQIAP plus or questioning, we always live a life of activism in a way, because coming out is a lifelong process. And, you know, meaning that every single space that we go in, we're always negotiating our identity, how much of it will show, how much of it will say, and is it safe to do so? And so, you know, that takes a lot of effort. And it takes, you know, probably over time, some wearing down of the soul. And so I can't say enough that, you know, I'll give you a really interesting example. I worked for an administrator when I was a teacher. And this administrator would go out of their way every time there was a staff event. People were bringing their partners or their spouses to the event, and this administrator would pop down, you know, to my classroom at the end of the day and say, "Hey, you know what? Don't forget, the staff are going bowling tonight. I hope you and your partner are going to come." And you know, that administrator probably never know, and if you ever happen to see this, I hope you know who you are. Thank you. Just that action of that administrator saying, you know, as the leader of this building, here's what I stand for. It's important for me, for you to know that you're included and that you're welcome. And I'm seeing to that. It's, you know what, for people who may not be, you know, most organizations, schools included, workplaces function on colonial, hetero, sexist, ableist, misogynist, you know, power structures and dynamics. And so that often, you know, we take for granted that, oh, I'm just going to show up, you know, somewhere, you know, at an organization and, you know, or an event. And, you know, my principal is going to be the first person who's going to come over and have a quick conversation. And that is golden. And it doesn't, maybe doesn't seem like much, but it's humongously golden to be able to do that. And I think that speaks to something as well, is that, you know, the more that we can pave the way for individuals to live their authentic lives, the more I think of all the loss of human potential that happens when folks are not given space to be authentically who they are, and they're worried about their safety and they're thinking about coming out. You know, I have to, if I want to hold my wife's hand going down the street, which I want to, I have to think about where I'm doing it, because I have to think that there's probably a good chance that someone's going to say something, and that's happened before. And so, you know, that's just a small thing, but it's a big thing. And I can't say enough how small gestures, and that is a form of activism, can lead to bigger gestures. And the more that organizations from the top down, you know, clearly and visibly enact that they value all their employees, all the youth in the building, all the seniors in their home, that they're going to create this space where seniors going into care don't have to worry about the complexities of their relationship with their same-sex partner in a senior's home, and whether or not they're even going to be able to be together. You know, I think that we're creating this movement for change. And I don't want anyone to mistake for 5 seconds to think that I'm naive, and that going to lead to sweeping monumental change. But I think in many ways that they're life-saving and they're life-affirming. And when we do that, we are validating people so that they have the strength to carry on and to speak out more and to speak their truth to power. And I think that you know, and I was speaking about silence before, people know what's in your heart. And if you aren't sure, ask. I'd rather someone ask and question, you know, and then be okay and move on, than just not say anything at all and, you know, just keep the silence. And I think that, you know, within this, you know, within this as well, when we talk about silence, you know, the history of the queer community, like many marginalized communities, has been you know, omitted from history, right? So that I certainly didn't learn about the experience of the queer community at school, and if I did ever, and if I, again, and I said it was always in a negative context. And so I didn't know my history, and I still don't, and I still have to do work to find it out. But I know that the history of the queer community is such a rich history, and it's so important to get out there, because and just certainly to recognize those that, you know, came before us. And, you know, and I talked about the value of pride, particularly in you know, within small communities, is that, you know, the history of pride is that the first pride was a riot, right, in Stonewall, and of people who were tired of being, you know, targeted and outed in newspapers and targeted by the police. And, you know, in Canada, we had the bathhouse raids, and, you know, the targeting of the communities there. So, you know, pride was born out of activism. And I think it's so important, you know, for those of us within the community to recognize all those who have gone before us, because, you know what, we might get annoyed if we see corporate commercialization sometimes, but there's a whole bunch of people who sacrificed their lives, and they didn't do it for an Oreo cookie, but to get to this point in society where corporations and individuals are at least paying attention. Maybe they want our money, but they are paying attention to the value of the queer community as a consumer. And I think too, within, you know, this activist work too, it's so important to pay tribute to those who have come before us and those who are continuing to do the work. And I think it's also, you know, history moves in a variety of ways. And, you know, sometimes I've heard people, you know, say, well, you know, why didn't someone speak out, you know, prior to? And, you know, it's a whole different set of circumstances that lead us to where we are today. And you know what, there's, you know, still people not speaking out today for a whole host of reasons. And I think we have to acknowledge that, but work to create power and spaces for more people to feel good about speaking out and making change. And I also think in acknowledging, you know, folks who, and I'm using folks in the FOLXS way, to trust the voice of youth now too. That, you know, youth are, again, on the forefront of change and, you know, reclaiming power in their identity and, you know, expanding our understanding of gender and all those possibilities. And I think that's absolutely phenomenal, in such important work as well. But I think too, you know, something that it's always struck me, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the education setting and maybe community response. You know, when we look at some of those stats that I mentioned earlier, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, related to, you know, the experiences of queer youth in school, or homelessness, or the links between, you know, mental health, depression, and anxiety in the queer community. You know, when people see that, I think a lot of people have this, this gut response, like we have to do something about this, and we don't want to see you suffer, and so we see expansions of, programs around mental health, really geared to work to support 2S LGBTQIAP+ youth. We see the formation of, what started off under the banner of gay straight alliances in school, pride clubs, and gender and sexual diversity alliances, which are so very, very important. But sometimes I think what's really interesting and reflective is, when youth or members of the community, are sort of are in a crisis mode, there is a willingness to respond and be responsive. But the second that, people start to say, I want to show the pride within this movement too, within our community. So, I'm wondering, I don't see myself represented anywhere. I'm wondering, could we have, a bunch of books, within our workplace library, within our school library, showcasing, featuring the lives of queer individuals and the diversity of the lives of queer individuals, people start to say, like, well, maybe our workplace can participate in pride and actually go to the pride parades and not just put up the rainbow sticker. And then we start to get like, oh, this pushback, right? Like, if you're in a crisis, we're going to help you. But if you are in this point where you're starting to say, I want to not just always be in a crisis. I want to feel validated. I want other people to feel validated, that respected, reflected, and valued. People are like, I don't know if we can do that. It might make people feel uncomfortable, or whoa, we can't talk about gender or sexual orientation that openly, as if it's a taboo subject. And I say that often, and often people will push back against that. And I wish we could have more of a conversation here. If there happens to be anyone online and you want to ask a question or interject at any point. But people will come back after I've said that, often later on, and they've had a chance to think about it. And they say, I think you're right. And it's not that I want to be right. It's just that I think the more that people become comfortable in their own skin and their identities and their orientations. And, it's a challenge to the cisgender, heterosexual, normative ways that everything functions on a daily basis. People start to be like, I don't know how to negotiate this space. I don't know. And it might make people feel uncomfortable. So we're not going to do anything. And again, I think that inaction can be very, very damaging. And, I guess something I just wanted to say here, and then maybe I'll quickly open it up for some questions. A really easy way to start and get involved is to take a look around your workplace or your place of, where you go to the gym, where you do your recreational activities, your school, if you're there, and do something, a quick equity look. And look around in the halls and the walls. Who's represented? Who's not represented? Who's missing from the picture, and how are people represented? Who's missing from the textbooks? Who's missing from the literature? Who's missing from the pamphlets? Whose stories are we telling? Whose stories are we not telling? And then why? What are the company's policies and procedures? Does an organization have a policy or a procedure supporting sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression? And if it doesn't, it starts to beg questions as to why. How are forms collecting data? How are people thinking about pronouns? All these different things are so important, and they're such important pieces of activism and making change, that I can't say enough that it's the small steps and individual steps that are going to make the change. And don't get me wrong, lending your voice out in the streets, and certainly I can think of sometimes when, in doing that, I was frightened for my own safety. But in the long run, it's led to societal change, and I think that's so key. And I think the more that people are able to overcome their silence, able to overcome their discomfort, and are willing to say, you know what, I can't be in this space anymore, where people's identities and lives are seen as any less than everyone else's. I think until we can do that, we're going to be sort of just still bumping along. But the more people that, can get involved and just make some of those small changes and, steps towards activism, I think, wow, what power we have to make a difference in someone's lives. So I can't believe that it's 12:48 now. And I'm just wondering if anyone has any questions at this point. I'll try my best to answer them.
All right, thanks, Lori. To the other participants here, if you wish to unmute yourselves and ask a question, that would be great. If not, if you feel like asking a question using the chat window, if you look at the bottom of the screen, you can, hi, Deborah, you can open your chat window and type in a question. Does anyone want to get the ball rolling? If not, I will. Lori, we can't talk about this without getting slightly political. And I'm going to approach it from the background that three of us have in common, that is education. And before I was a principal, I was a math educator. And it seems like nothing could be further removed from issues of equity and diversity than mathematics. And so I was so pleased to see the new grade 9 math curriculum with sections on human rights and inclusion, culturally sensitive pedagogy. Unfortunately, that got removed in the final version. And in a sense, what you said about, change needs to be driven from top down. I thought if that had been there, that might have been a tipping point for us, to get us past the ignoring the issues. And I was very disappointed in that. And I don't know if you're up to speed on that or what your feelings are on that, Lori.
I agree. It's political, and I'm disappointed but not surprised, and that it was taken out. I think, something I should have said too, it was taken out, but there was enough people that knew about it. And I think that's where the power lies. And I guess one of the things I didn't speak to enough is about the power. Change has to come from the top up, but it's certainly the grassroots that have led that change. Can also lead to change, right? But keep asking those questions of where's it gone? And what I'm heartened to see in education is outside of what's in a curriculum document is important, because what is written is important. But more and more, we're starting to see educators and boards themselves start to talk about things such as culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy outside of that document, and pushing to have increased visibility and narratives taught within. But certainly, we've known with previous governments too, when they were trying to be more expansive and, include, identities within, queer identities and curriculum, think of the health and physical education curriculum, the pushback we get. But the more that we are consciously always saying, we know it's there, we know it's supposed to be there, and asking those hard questions, why are you taking it out? Because math is not neutral. How it's taught is not neutral. The examples are not neutral. When we don't teach about Alan Turing, for example, in computer science, or if we just say Alan Turing and we don't tell his story, we're contributing to that dominant narrative. And so my hope in that is that in knowing, we can put the pressure on and ask those questions, and not just like, oh, you took it out, why? It's the why that we have to ask, and keep asking it all the time. And you know what? There's going to be a provincial election happening as well. We've got a vote there. And, also I think, oftentimes, school boards are also accountable, for example, to their trustees. Oftentimes, people don't even vote for trustees because they don't, and that's not about the trustees, it's about people not knowing the value of the work of the trustee. Right? So, there's somewhere else that I think that, activism and action can happen, and specifically to education, as you were asking me.
Thank you. Any other questions? Seeing none, hearing none. I will say thank you. Thank you very much, Lori, for sharing that with us. It was enlightening, to hear your stories, your activism connected with your personal history and your experience. Is the best. The personal and the political and the activism all go hand in hand. And I thank you for sharing with us today, and wish you all, everyone here and everyone sharing following on YouTube, a wonderful day. And join us at Thousand Islands Pride. It's Pride Week in Gananoque. Tonight is the karaoke at the Stonewall Pub. So join us there if you will, or join us back here tomorrow for another Lunch and Learn featuring Story Time by Lulu. So thank you to the participants, and thank you, Lori. Have a wonderful day. And unfortunately, I don't have a fade to black function. So the only thing I can do is click on this little button that says end.
Oh, hang on a moment.
Oh.
I just want to say hi.
Hey, Deborah.
Lori and I haven't seen each other in a decade.
No, nice.
Yeah.
Yeah. How are you?
I'm all right.